where microservices is a huge mistake. Before we get to that, I want to remind you that we vote before and after the panel. So I'm gonna put the link about the topic of the panel, and this is the before link. So basically, before you hear any of us, right, if you agree or disagree with the statement, please vote. And after everything, we'll take a second vote. And so the team who will swing the most voters will win. So please feel free to start voting in the link I put in the Discord as BTB-panel channel. And also there is an optional field for the questions. So feel free to put some questions for the panelists in that field and we will use them. So we have two moderators, myself and William Morgan, the CEO and co-founder of Buoyant, service mesh company, the father of Linkerd, and we have four esteemed panelists. So now we will introduce all the panelists and they will share their relations to microservices. And after that, we will put forward the motion and debate it. So William, take it away as an introduction.
Oh, I have to start. Okay. Well, hi, everyone. I'm William Morgan. As Lexi mentioned, I'm the CEO of a company called Buoyant. I'm also one of the, at least nominally, one of the creators of Linkerd, which is a service mesh, open source service mesh, which is a piece of technology that only works with microservices. So I am extremely biased and ready to cast legal challenges to any votes that I don't like. What is my relationship to microservices? I used to be pure and, unsullied by these topics. And then I did work at Twitter for a while. Pete, I see you there now. During Twitter's kind of famous explosion from monolith to microservices, although I don't think we had that word at the time. We called it an SOA. And that was my introduction to this, and everything in my life has basically been kind of following on from the service mesh onwards, has been following on from that horrific / amazing experience.
Let's go in some random order of the Zoom. So Nick is next.
Hi, my name is Nick Schrock. I'm the CEO and founder of a company called Elemental, and we're the people behind Dagster, which is that up there. But in my previous life, where I formed my opinion on microservices, was when I was at Facebook in 2009, 2017. And effectively, the early part of my career was spent as kind of part of the core team and one of the architects who our mandate was to save our monolith, and we succeeded. And then one of the outputs of that was an open source technology that I co-created and co-wrote the spec called GraphQL, which ironically is now an active participant in the microservices ecosystem, which is ironic. I look forward to contextualizing and more precisely defining the polemical tweet that spurred this discussion. On to the next one.
Thank you, Nick. Chris, you're next.
Yeah, hi, I'm Chris Richardson. How did I really get into this microservice thing? Well, way back like 2008-9, I created this early PaaS called Cloud Foundry. And that was for deploying Java applications on EC2. And that was actually a monolith. And then ultimately that got acquired, and that's where the name, not the technology of the current Cloud Foundry comes from. And then around 2010, I read this book, The Art of Scalability, and they had this 3-dimensional model of scaling. And one of the dimensions, the y-axis, was functional decomposition, which was like breaking things apart and breaking an otherwise large application into smaller pieces, primarily to tackle complexity, but also to deal with load. And it was like, wow, yeah, you could do that. And then I looked back at the original Cloud Foundry and it was like, that would have helped a lot. So I kind of just got interested in this style of architecture, even though there wasn't really a name, and actually was investigating it. And in my role as doing developer relations at VMware, I gave a talk on this thing first time 2012. and ever since then, that's all I've been doing. So I guess there is, there is some emotional investment in there, but I'm prepared to get over it eventually. So yeah, no, so today, I mean, I normally would say I travel around the world working with clients, which of course has since March has not been possible. So I've been helping clients use the microservice architecture effectively from my home office in Oakland. My sort of, if I was to say in a one sentence what my position is here, it's like, it depends, right?
Thank you very much, Chris. Kiki is next.
There. So I am Kiki Carter. I am a software engineer at Livent, and how I was swept into this world of microservices is, it kind of goes back to my background in consulting and in the consulting business. You know, a lot of times you get people who have read, and I feel like this should somewhat be banned, but you get some executive who reads CIO magazine and they say, oh, we absolutely have to do this. And at that time, what we have to do was the digital revolution. Everything needed to be going digital. We need to do this digital wave, and we're digitizing this and digitizing that. And what that ended up really meaning was people wanted to modernize applications, and they wanted to modernize them sometimes using emerging technology. And you get swept up in this world of all of these words and things that have meaning, and sometimes they have not so clear meaning, I'd put it that way. And one of those things we got into was microservices. You know, at that time it was SOA. And those tenets still remain strong. And I believe that those characteristics of SOA remain strong. How we implemented it way back when was not great. And we've made another evolution in implementing it using this thing we call microservices. And I believe we will make yet another evolution in this world of microservices, and may perhaps be called something else. But that's sort of been my journey and my arc into the microservices world. It's been around digitizing, and around modernizing, and around really evolving applications and systems, mostly not greenfield. So places where monoliths existed, and not only were there monoliths existing, there were other legacy systems that existed, and mainframes that existed, and people who you had to play very nicely with. So I did not come from a very clean and pristine, we're building greenfield microservices world, and therefore I have a beautiful view of it. That's not how I created my view. But that being said, I will put my my stake in the ground here that microservices were indeed not a mistake. And I will elaborate on why I feel that way. And as you can see, I'm from Atlanta, so I'm hoping to be able to turn this state a little bit, you know, based on this locality. So that is me.
Thank you very much, Kiki. We'll see how the swing vote goes. And Pete is the last but not least. Take it away, Pete.
Hey, everybody. I'm Pete, currently a tech lead at Twitter, but that's a fairly recent development for me. For the past couple of years, I was actually managing a pretty big org within Twitter as an EM, which included what we call health infrastructure, which is like the rules engine that computes features and classifies tweets as spammy or abusive, as well as all the internal tools that support health. So, reviewing content, that kind of thing. A lot of within that group, there's like a whole spectrum of like monolithic applications and then highly microservicized applications. So seen a lot there at Twitter. I came in via acquisition. My company, Smite, was bought. We were doing similar stuff, trust and safety things. We had a monolith. We had a bunch of services as well. It was kind of a hybrid architecture. And before that, I was an engineer at Facebook, which is how I know Nick. And actually worked on 2 monoliths there. Facebook's www is a monolithic architecture, as well as Instagram. So seen a couple different iterations of these types of architectures. The reason why I kind of started caring a lot about this space was because over the past couple of years, I've interviewed lots of engineers, and on like every resume, they say, oh, we decompose the monolith into microservices. And this is from engineers coming from companies of like 4 people all the way to companies of, tens of thousands of people. And I'm thinking to myself, you can't possibly all have the same needs and concerns. And you during the interview, you start to ask questions. And I started to get the sense that maybe we were over pivoting a little bit on this whole microservices thing. And that started to get reinforced with some of the things that I saw within Twitter, which again has monolithic architectures that work well, microservices architectures that work well, and also monolithic architectures that don't work well, and microservice architectures that don't work well. So really excited to dig into this conversation. Very happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much, Pete. So now we'll move to the debate phase, and it will work as follows. I will put forward the motion, which is recorded in this panel, and I will actually announce the vote, which we have right now. You will be surprised that voter turnout is record. I think in our democracy for Scale by the Bay, we've never seen anything like this. We had, 73 responses. So the motion is, where microservices is a huge mistake, and will they spawn a multi-billion-dollar cleanup industry, as proposed by Nick? And currently, the team arguing for the motion, so against microservices, Nick and Pete. The team defending microservices, the team microservices are fine and peachy, is Chris and Kiki. So Nick and Pete, I must tell you, you have an uphill battle. The incumbents are entrenched. Basically, 75% are saying, no, they were not a mistake, right? So you have essentially your work carved out in front of you. And so now we will make the opening statements. The team mistake, I will call them team mistake and fine for short. Team mistake will open, start with Nick will frame the motion, and then I would say Chris will, as the captain of the team fine, will respond, and then Pete will open, and then Kiki will respond. And so after that, we have a general melee and general debate using questions. You can kind of debate with each other, and we will add some questions from ourselves, William and myself, and the audience. And in the end, we'll do closing statements. So Nick, open it up.
Okay, thank you. So it was my tweet originally, so I take responsibility. I think the most important thing when discussing this topic is to precisely define what we mean by microservices. So, for example, both Kiki and Chris use the term SOA, service-oriented architecture, and microservices.
No, sorry.
Whoop.
I didn't.
Oh, I'm sorry. Two of you, maybe William did, use the term SOA and microservices.
I said it.
Use the term SOA and microservices interchangeably. I think they are two very different things. So my definition of microservices comes from what I consider like the canonical article on this, which is Martin Fowler's article, which is services built around business capabilities and independently deployable by fully automated deployment machinery. Now, the critical term in that is business capability. Do you decide to model your system across business capabilities and then put process boundaries between those business capabilities? That is the problem. I'm not arguing against services. For example, at Facebook, which I consider a monolith because it has an application monolith, Facebook has hundreds of services. So it will require service message, and those industries that I referred to will exist healthily and happily if lots of architectures like that existed. I am specifically talking about microservices with dividing by business capabilities, because in reality, the vast majority of the time, what it actually is a distributed monolith where you think you are separating concerns about process boundaries, but you are actually inflicting enormous damage on yourself. You make change dramatically more difficult. You encode your organizational boundaries in process boundaries. And in fact, it's worse than that, because organizations change all the time. you reorganize, you decide new product directions. And so in fact, the process boundaries in an org, like take like Uber, for example, which I believe has over 5,000 services, which is for their scale of organization, in my opinion, total and complete madness. And it's because that it encodes the entire lineage of your organizational history. In some ways, ironically with Uber, I do consider microservices sort of kind of like a ideological libertarianism gone mad, where like you show up to Uber your first day. This is like back in the day, right? And you have like your tote bag, you got your Ayn Rand novel in there, and then it's like, oh, we're going to have like a market of services and everyone's going to have their own programming language. And there's going to be this like mutually beneficial transaction in the system that forms. And I just don't think that's how the world works. So I guess why I really am passionate about this subject is that I see teams using this. So microservices are a tool. There are cases where a monolith is so far gone, maybe the people who could save it are gone, that as an engineering leader, I would recommend it. My problem is I think it's used probably 2 orders of magnitude too often as a tool, right? Microservices it's a tool, it's not a goal. And so why I'm passionate about this is I see lots of small startups who are building business apps that are not particularly technically novel, and they have some small number of engineers, and they have more GitHub repos and more services than engineers. And it's totally crazy. They should build a web server and like a JavaScript app. And they should be iterating with their clients. But they're cargo culting more mature engineering organizations. They want to use Kubernetes. They want to be able to tell Pete in their interview that they migrated their monolith to a microservices. So I think there's a lot of cargo culting and performative behavior here that actually causes enormous damage. You can have separation of concerns without process boundaries. You can have organization without process boundaries. We have folders, we have functions. These tools exist, they can be used. So that's how I feel about the subject.
Thank you very much, Nick. That was a very powerful statement, and I think really we all should remember with folders and functions. I think that's really good to keep in mind. And to answer, Chris Richardson will open.
Yeah, well, so you could say that there's like you have to pick an architecture, and let's just, I'm oversimplifying slightly, but basically the fundamental choice is, do you have a monolithic architecture or a microservice architecture, right? I would just view those as 2 alternative architectural styles, each with their own respective set of benefits and drawbacks. And always saying use the monolithic architecture or just use the microservice architecture are both equally flawed sort of technical positions. And the architecture that you should use depends on your application at the current point in time. And like, I would certainly agree with Nick. It's like, yeah, if you're an early stage startup, you should almost always use a monolith, right? And only once you grow and actually have the problems of complexity and possibly scalability that the microservice architecture addresses, should you then consider migrating to that architecture. So I want to just clarify, so my definition of microservice architecture, right, it's a set of services which are basically mini applications, right, that are independently deployable. So, and they have to be loosely coupled, right? Like building a tightly coupled microservice architecture is a major mistake. And then in terms of granularity, to me, a good starting point is 1 service per team, because the primary goal I view it as is enabling teams to be autonomous, right? And you should be structuring your engineering organization as a loosely coupled network of autonomous teams that are able to develop and test and deploy primarily independently. And so by application of Conway's law, you need a loosely coupled architecture. And And yeah, and if your application is small, monolith is fine. If it grows, eventually I think you're going to get the need for a microservice architecture. Maybe the comment around organizing around business capabilities is really interesting. I mean, I know on the one hand, yeah, organizational structures evolve, but on the other hand, the core business functions are often, I could argue, are very stable, right? Like, I don't know, I mean, like an example off the top of my head, like all banks have had the capability of depositing a check, right? And it's been that way for, I don't know, a long time, right? And but how you've deposited the check has evolved, right? From physically taking it to a branch to scanning it with your smartphone. But deposit check as a capability has existed. So I would argue that, yeah, your organizational structure can vary, but your core business capabilities tend to be pretty stable. And to me, that is actually a good organizing principle.
Thank you, Chris.
I'll stop there. I could go on for a while, but I won't.
Thank you. Now, opening for the team mistake, Pete Hunt.
I love the word team mistake. It feels like I'm being judged.
Well, I'm sorry, you're radical extremists. You're far monolith cult people, clearly.
Yes, clearly. So I'm glad we're talking about Conway's law, because I think that is really at the core of a lot of this. You know, both Chris and Nick have brought it up already. And you know, I agree with a lot of what you said, Chris. But I would kind of take issue with maybe one or 2 points. But I think it really boils down to like how confident can you get that your org structure is going to be stable. I guess that's the underlying theme here, is that if you're going to bake the organization structure into your software, like how confident can you get that organizational structure is going to be stable? And I think that it really depends on which teams you're talking about. So, you know, for example, there's a team within Twitter that maintains key value storage service. We're probably going to need key value storage forever. Requirements for key value storage aren't going to change that much. That's a great candidate for something to put into a separate service. However, there's a bunch of different business requirements that change, you know, all the time. And in fact, we're since I've been here, you know, we've reorged a couple of times, and I know that some companies reorg more often than others, but every time there's a reorg, there's a discussion of like, all right, who's going to own this service? Who's going to be on call for it? If we're going to turn this one team into 2 teams, you know, now we've got to go match the engineers that have knowledge of this service and put them onto the right team. So it presents some challenges when you're changing the organizational structure. And I also do think that business requirements change more often than you would think. I think GDPR is like a great example of this. There's this cross-cutting concern with GDPR now, where you know you have to be a good steward of your customers' data, and you've got to you know, put specific retention requirements on it, and you need to be able to tell them where their data is and delete it when they ask. And that's a concern that cuts across all of these different services. And you might take a look at a new concern like that and say, hey, maybe that structure that we came up with a couple of years ago doesn't make any sense anymore. Maybe we don't want to be passing these strings of customer data around all over the place. Maybe we want to move to passing opaque IDs. And so I think that, you know, when you start to, the more services that you have and the more kind of loosely coupled interfaces you have to develop, the more expensive it gets to change those interfaces when one of these cross-cutting concerns kind of comes in. So that's, you know, my point of view on that.
Thank you, Pete. And now the opening statement from Kiki.
Yeah, thank you. And I would like to start by saying I don't think that it's fair to say that SOA is interchangeable with microservices. I was giving that example as sort of the journey of how we've gone with, you know, we said this type of architecture, now this type of architecture, and certainly something else. And I also like to say, just because something has been done incorrectly and maybe has been done inefficiently and effectively, or we've seen it done wrong, doesn't mean that it is in fact wrong. I like to go back to this interesting quote, which is, you cannot judge a philosophy by its abuses. You cannot judge a philosophy by its abuses. And many of us have seen abuses in microservices and also in monoliths themselves. And I'm not here to judge the monolith itself or the microservice by the abuses of either one, because you can find those on both sides of the fence. So I would lay it out like that. And what is a monolith but a microservice that, you know, if it's a monolith that is the right size, that is just for a specific thing, then it is essentially a microservice. And what is a microservice but also a monolith? It is a small application, but it is, you know, also a monolith. So you don't, you know, separating them with these words and not with the intention is causing sort of a confusion around this debate. And so I don't think that microservices were a mistake. I do think perhaps in naming, but certainly not in the necessary characteristics. And it's wrong to suggest that we should not have evolved to deliver these characteristics at scale and in distributed environments where that makes sense. And meaning where your environment is distributed. So to me, I look at it as, and other people have said this, you know, these are autonomous cooperative services. And that's a lot harder to say than microservices, but that's essentially what we're after. And my argument is that it's not for reasons that are completely obvious. A lot of times you hear people frame this microservice architecture as something that's going to solve all of your problems. It's going to help you get your speed to market. It's going to help your resume building, and it's going to make it easier for you to code fast and deploy more features, et cetera, et cetera. But those are not the things that I feel like are most important. Believe it or not, there are things I feel are even more important in this architecture than being able to say, we release code to production every 7 seconds, you know, companies who say that type of thing. And what I see as very important in this system is being resilient and having this resilience due to being centered on truth. And so what do microservices have to do with truth? Okay, I'm taking this way out here now. Autonomous services that own their own data in context have the means to present more truthful statements and APIs. And here, of course, I'm invoking something like promise theory or system stability at scale. And data alone cannot answer those questions without context, and state without data backing it up, you know, cannot easily survive environmental failures. And whether you're having a monolith or a microservice, you will experience environmental failures. Yes, they are, you know, network partitions and things like that become more of a danger in a microservices environment, but failure exists within each of those. And you have to organize your system in such a way, and I won't say things like lines of business or anything like that, but you have to organize your system in such a way that it can provide answers that come from as close to the source of truth as possible. And that's not simply just state in your database, you know, state without context. Data cannot answer questions without context. And for that reason, I think when we talk about microservices, we have to look at how we're organizing state, how we're organizing the answers we give to people, and whether you say it's in a monolith or a microservice, however you want to say that, and how we cooperate with other people who need that information. How we can say that this is true, you know, hey, I'm telling you this information. Well, how do you know it's true? Well, based on these events or these facts, this is the information. And I like to say that we need to be fact-based or event-based. I think that facts are important. And I think that being able to derive views from other information is also important. And again, that goes into being able to collect and organize and understand events in such aggregates. And so I can continue, I'm gonna stop. But you know, we're all living in 2020. So it shouldn't be difficult to convince you that a system where truth is elusive can be easily destabilized. And that is why I feel like, you know, microservices or that architecture are really basing it on truth and facts and context around your data is very important and should not be thrown away.
All right, I'll ask a question now since we've gone through the opening statements, and thank you. That was a great set of opening statements. I like how we have team truth on one side and team mistake on the other. Of course, as we all know, the truth doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is getting the most votes. Alexi has not described whether there's an electoral college system involved here, or whether we're just taking the maximum number of votes, the majority, like, you know, some places do. Okay, sorry.
The humor is
stop with the election stuff.
It's too painful. We're still living.
Yeah, interesting time to have a vote-based system. Okay, so you know, I actually started looking at some of the questions here for the panel, which were posed, you know, from some people who filled out the form. A lot of these are not questions, so a lot of these are statements, like huge is a strong word. There's a question, is this just clickbait? Which I think is probably at least somewhat true. But actually, you know, I want to talk about the word huge for a second, right? The title of this panel is Microservices Were a Huge Mistake. And I think hopefully it's not too crazy to say that, like most engineering decisions, microservices are a trade-off, right? Like you're trading off something for something else. So my question to the panelists is around the word huge. Is the trade-off that you make in microservices, is that actually like an order of magnitude different from other types of engineering trade-offs? Say the trade-off between a NoSQL store and a SQL store, right? Is there something that's actually fundamentally different about that trade-off, or is it, you know, just an ordinary engineering trade-off?
Well, I mean, one comment I would make is I feel like the panel title is a mistake.
Well, if we can take
well, I mean, or just this premise. I mean, or just the premise that microservices are universally a mistake, right? Like, I don't know, snorting uranium is a mistake, right? But yeah, taking aspirin is not a mistake unless you happen to take too much of it, right? It does very much depend.
Man, what parties are you going to?
Yeah. That uranium, well, that was, I don't even know why I came up with that one. But you know, there's sort of this implied absolute mistake, or as constant mistake, is just really, really not helpful. I mean, so to get back to the specific question, I mean, this is a major architectural decision, right? It's sort of top level architecture. Am I going to use a monolith? Which, I mean, that's like a single deployable unit for my application, or am I going to use the microservice architecture, a collection of services, right? And so that's a very high level decision. And one of the traps, if you use it inappropriately, right, is that you build a distributed monolith, which is like all of the complexity of microservices with all of the with all of the friction of a monolith, right? So, you know, you go backwards, right, in terms of actual productivity. I mean, interestingly, that might get you a talk at QCon if you come up with create a badly designed microservice architecture, not naming names there. But, you know, there are severe negative consequences if you choose inappropriately and do it badly.
I think it's hard to know whether you're doing it well or doing it badly at the time that you're doing it, though, because a lot of times you don't know what the changes in requirements are going to be, you know, a year from now or 5 years from now. And depending on how many services you're creating and how different those services are. I mean, if you're creating a bunch of services that are all using the same libraries and same tech stack, and they're all deployed with the same tools, and it's generally pretty unified, then it's kind of no big deal if you get those boundaries a little bit wrong, right? You can go and work with that team and move engineers around to go work on that other service, on that other service. But over time, if we did get that division wrong and we have a lot of cross-cutting concerns between those multiple services, we better hope that those services don't evolve to be really really diverged, and then we start to see these like teams that are really specialized and have really strong ownership over that service, because then it makes it hard for us to kind of like work across these services, because each team has to kind of coordinate at each step of the way.
I agree with that, Pete. I definitely agree that that makes it difficult to coordinate, and it's even harder to coordinate in a distributed environment. But I feel like those same difficulties exist with the monolith. And if you get the boundaries wrong in a monolith, or you have to make some major changes in a monolith, have you seen the insanity that ensues when when you have to tear the entire thing apart in order to bring the thing up? It's like, and that could be indicative of just bad code or spaghetti code, or maybe you didn't componentize properly or organize your Git repo the best way. But those things happen, and if you do that in a monolithic environment, you tend to have to bring, and perhaps people are doing it much better, but before I've seen you tend to have to bring the whole house down to do a renovation, rather than being able to renovate one room at a time. And I feel like there is a trade-off there. Just to get back to that original question, there's a bit of a trade-off, but there's also sort of a necessary, I feel like it's a necessary tooling or a necessary philosophy, not calling things microservices or just throwing out tens of thousands and 5,000 and 100 microservices, but this idea that you need to create some really bounded context around something. And it may not be business function, it may be something totally different, in order to deal with the scale of just the scale of reality that we have here with today. I mean, we're talking about companies like, talking about companies like Twitter and this and that, and you say you've seen it with even smaller companies. And when it comes to small companies, to me, I think it's even more important to have resilient services, because you're hoping that, you can get a funding round or something, or you're hoping that you're not going to lose customers when you have only 2 or 3 customers. You want that experience to be a great experience for them. And so doing some heavy lifting on the engineering side in order to give people a better experience on the user side, I feel like is a trade-off, but I feel like it is a necessary trade-off, and it's one that has a better payoff in the end, if that's the case.
Nick, do you have a point of view?
No, not at all. No, just kidding. Well, first of all, to Chris's point, I actually myself, even though I was the author of the tweet, believe that it's not a healthy frame for a discussion like this. So yes, it was clickbait, and I think I am guilty as charged, as is Alexi, not to call someone out. But I think what I mean by microservices are fundamentally and catastrophically bad idea. What in a more productive framing, I would say that the idea that microservices are the default and the norm and the ideal is a really bad idea, and that it gets misapplied and is like kind of like the default thing to do. Whereas I think it should be generally the exception to the rule in most circumstances. Like I said in the preface, there are circumstances where if I was put in charge of an engineering organization and you had lost complete control out of the monolith, that it's the right thing to do to start stripping it apart into process boundaries so you can actually horizontally scale your org. Or actually, Chris, I thought your example of a bank was good. Like when some of the business capabilities are that stable. And in fact, you could think of them as even outsourcing them to different companies. Like that's appropriate. And this happens on the inverse too, when like you acquire, one company acquires another thing. And I would never advocate, like, regardless of context or situation, that you immediately like rope that acquiree into the acquirer's code base, right? So that's one thing. I think actually, one word that I heard a couple times was autonomy. And Jake Donham, an ex-Twitter engineer, has a fantastic talk where he describes the trade-offs between these different approaches. And he describes the trade-off as between leverage and autonomy. And I think that is a very, very fair way to frame the problem, because from my perspective, given the choice between leverage and autonomy, I choose leverage every time, because in my opinion, leverage optimizes for outcomes and the value you can deliver to your users and stakeholders. Whereas, in general, people who advocate for microservices architectures and very granular ones often really emphasize autonomy, which I believe is a local optimization rather than a global optimization. It's a fantastic talk, by the way. I highly recommend it. And would, by the way, Alexi be a much less polemical framing by which to set up a debate like this.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you an example. As a consulting client a few years ago, the CIO of the organization read an ebook that I wrote on microservices, and then went back to his organization and said, okay, people, we're doing microservices. And this was an 8,000 person organization, which was very hierarchical. So the boss spoke, it percolated down the hierarchy. And then when I was brought in to do some consulting, I talked to these developers and it was like, why are you doing microservices? Because my boss told me to. And it got to the point where doing microservices was a KPI. So their bonuses were like, function of the number of services that had been written. And that one story caused me a couple of years ago to give a talk on anti-patterns of microservice adoption, which is like doing microservices just for this. Well, first off, it's a magic pixie dust, but then doing microservices just for the sake of it. I mean, it really, as I said at the very beginning, your choice of architecture depends on the context at a given point in time.
Wait a minute,
blindly
Chris,
doing
this seems
it.
like this is like the perfect crime for you. You gave them this book, they read it, it was so good that they started doing microservices, and then you had to come in to help them. That was like,
oh, cunning.
Yeah.
No, I just don't like that. I mean, they misread the part. So the other thing that I am seriously into is the concept of a pattern, right? Because that's a recurring solution, a reasonable solution to a recurring problem. And the key part of that is you have the benefits and the drawbacks, and so which help you decide whether that's an appropriate solution for your context. And if you skip over that part, you're on a path to trouble.
So I really like this talk of trade-offs. The next question I'd like to pose is, are there changes in technology that shift the decision surface area? So for example, I am fully immersed in the world of Kubernetes and containers and cloud native and all that stuff. And one of the arguments that I've heard is that, microservices are a lot easier to run because now, by the time you've learned Kubernetes, which is certainly like non-trivial to learn, running one service is kind of similar to running 10, is kind of similar to running 100. So is that a realistic argument, or are there other types of technologies that might change the decision surface area between should I use microservices or not?
I think that's an incredibly insightful question. And it's really onto something, because I think a lot of the problem with monoliths and in today's world is the technologies they're built on top of. So traditionally, when people are building monoliths out of the gate, they're using fairly heavyweight ORMs like Django or Rails. And I think Rails in particular is a huge problem for companies that want to organizationally scale a large software program. It doesn't have to be, the Twitter famously, effectively had to blow up their monolith because they were unable to manage their Rails monolith. And so I think that underlying technology changes, if a framework emerged that was pure software that laid out a vision of what these monoliths could look like, I think would go a long way towards addressing this. And similarly, like Kubernetes makes it much easier and fun to spin up lots of services, and therefore certainly contributes to the popularity of microservices.
Yeah, and actually, if you look at the Google trends for microservices, it starts its hockey stick right when Kubernetes is released. Correlation is not causation, but I think that's something to do with it. For me, my kind of criticisms of the microservice architecture actually have very little to do with distributed systems concerns and like operational concerns, because we do have great tools for running lots of services at scales. We have Kubernetes, we have service mesh architectures, we have distributed tracing. For me, it's about the cost of cross-cutting changes at the end of the day. And I think that's almost more of an organizational problem, that if microservices are the default thing that you reach for, by default, you're baking your org structure at that moment into your code base more aggressively than if that's not your default tool. And for changes that fall like kind of cleanly into that structure and cleanly into that delineation of services or your org, those are generally going to be your cheaper changes to make, right? Like that's kind of your median change is the way I think of it. And I think a lot of where I kind of see the disconnect between myself and a lot of advocates for microservices is I see the case for the median change getting a lot faster in microservice architecture. What I don't see is the case is the tail latency, the P99 change. The bigger changes that your organization has to tackle are usually dominating the resource allocation that your organization is putting in. Like the changing the color of a button versus changing your data retention policy across the whole org. Like one of those is way more expensive than the other one. And one of them cuts across all the services. And so when I advocate kind of against microservices, again, it's not like microservices are universally bad. It's just that it should be a sad day when you have to spin up a new service, not a happy day. And the reason for that is because I think that every new service you bring up, that P99 gets a little bit higher. And just like we measure P99 latency as our kind of core metric for success when we're looking at a distributed system, not the median latency, it's because it's more indicative of like what is going to dominate the runtime of your delivery. So while I do think that like tools like Kubernetes and Mesos have really reduced the cost of the operational stuff, that's not really my main concern about it, certainly not in 2020.
An interesting thought occurred to me the other day. I want to get back to your P99 change thing, but it's sort of like, imagine you have a massive application, right? So there's one strategy, say, is to break it up into services, each with their own deployment pipeline, right? So in other words, you're reducing the scalability required in your deployment pipeline technology, right? Whereas if you stick with them, but at the expense of sort of operational complexity and many more moving parts in production. Whereas if you have a monolith, your operational side is kind of simple because you have one application and you just run it behind a load balancer. But you then have all of this complexity around your deployment infrastructure so that you can parallelize your builds and have this, build, test, and deploy of this massive monolith take a very short amount of time. So it's sort of like there's like complexity somewhere in this whole process. And the other one is, if you got a massive code base, right? I feel like cross-cutting concerns are really hard anyway, right? Like you might have to, you got a gazillion modules. You might have to implement data retention policies in each one, regardless of whether those modules are packaged together as a monolith or deployed independently as services, right? So, I mean, I kind of just feel like if you're if you got a big system, it's complex, and complex stuff is just hard, right? No matter how you've sliced it up. Except for the fact, in the case of microservices, my world as a service developer is considerably simpler, because I can ignore the rest of the application apart from the immediate dependencies of my service.
But I think the way that it ends up playing out in practice often is, yeah, by the way, I totally agree with you. That, like, if you've got a big cross-cutting concern, it's going to be painful in any architecture that you have. And I also agree with you that, you know, in terms of deployment and operating a monolith versus microservices, it's like you're trading one type of complexity for another type of complexity in many cases. So, you know, operating a monolith of sufficient size is hard too. You know, with respect to these cross-cutting concerns, I think it's great as long as all the different microservice teams are like using the same abstractions and using the same technologies and using the same shared libraries. And I feel like, just kind of anecdotally, when you've got a microservice architecture and these really strong bounded contexts surrounding them, and teams that have really strong ownership over those services, they tend to diverge and do things in different ways. And that reduces the fungibility of engineers in the organization to go be able to like work across these different services. And then when it comes time to implement these cross-cutting changes, you know, it becomes a really hard cross-team coordination effort. You know, you can't like just spin up a team to go work on a business problem anymore. You got to go file a bunch of tickets on 20 different teams to go get anything done.
I lean towards just having a consensus-based technology stack that evolves slowly based on the changing sort of market, what's current in the marketplace, as opposed to the individual whims of, I want to use Haskell today because it's cool, or Rust, sort of decision making.
Well, I think that it's interesting that we're imagining that, oh, because of the technology, if everyone's using the same technology, then it makes it a little bit easier for us to do these cross-cutting concerns. And I don't know if that's necessarily the case, that it becomes a little bit easier. Maybe because you can move people around, possibly that could be a reason why it's easier. But I think that pointing to the tech stack and even the tools that we use to operationalize and whatnot is kind of, maybe there's a better way to think about it than that. And I would posit that maybe we should be thinking about it in terms of, you know, having common protocols. And I feel like that is something that is emerging and rising out. You know, we're looking at more common protocols, ways that we can talk to each other, ways that we can make progress without all using the same tech stack. And I think that, you know, being able to like, not being, I don't want to say stuck with the technology, but not being distracted by the next shiny tech, for example, Haskell, because, you know, Haskell for your fun. I think that that's also distracting for teams. And when it comes to the massive mess that we will have to clean up, because on that, I do agree with Nick's statement that there's been a lot of damage wrought by not microservices, but what I would call the abuses of that philosophy. And I feel like, you know, I still don't believe that that's something that we should give up. I still go back to the point of, if you have a well-formed monolith and it's doing one thing very well, then it is essentially an autonomous service. You may use different words. It may not cooperate with anyone but the user, but it is an autonomous and cooperative service. And if you had a single microservice, it would just be that, a monolith. So I don't think that when we talk about those cross-cutting concerns or changes that have to be made and what's the expense of a change, it's not really around the things that you may think it's around. And in reality, cross-cutting concerns and changes that have to be made on massive applications typically come down to people, organizations, politics, and the human beings involved, not the technology, because everything technological has an answer. We have answers for all the things except for the people.
Thank you, Kiki. On this great note, I think it's time for us to wrap up, and I invite each of you to make 1 minute closing statement. It should end with, and this is why you should vote that microservices were a huge mistake, or, and this is why you should vote that microservices were not a huge mistake. And so the link for voting is already in the chat. For the Discord, guys, please start voting. And we'll go in the same order. Actually, we'll alternate the order. So let's start with Chris, closing statement, 1 minute.
Oh, okay, yeah. So, so the world in general and the markets within which businesses operate is incredibly dynamic and unpredictable. COVID, prime example of that. Businesses need to be nimble, which in turn requires IT to deliver software rapidly, frequently, and reliably, and sustainably over a long period of time, because these applications can last for a while. If you read the Accelerate book, that will tell you that you need an architecture that's loosely coupled, modular, deployable, and testable. So if you have a small application, small team, a monolith is usually an excellent choice. But once your team and your application and its team grows, right, in order to have these loosely coupled, modular, testable, deployable architecture, you should consider using the microservice architecture. So I would say that claiming microservices are a mistake is itself a mistake.
Chris, closing statement from the opposing team, from Nick.
Sure. So the claim is not that microservices aren't a bad idea all the time. The claim is that they're, in modern day practice, a bad idea most of the time. And that, I think, to Pete's point, people who are making the decision to adopt them believe they're making a technical decision, but they're actually making a profound organizational decision that will be nearly impossible to undo. There are organizations where it's appropriate to do microservices or some sort of services, whether they're micro or not. Amazon makes a lot of sense to have lots of services. They made an explicit organizational choice to do that has very explicit trade-offs. Most applications in the world are not Amazon. Most applications are delivering a single application ontology, and it's very important for it to deliver it quickly, to make changes quickly, to iterate fast, and to deliver for your users. So that's why I think it's a huge mistake, because I think people are just kind of copying other organizations who operate under dramatically different constraints and using the tool inappropriately. And I actually think it has profound consequences for those companies that adopt it.
Closing statement from Kiki.
Yeah, I think that if you look at microservices and perhaps if we just say services are autonomous, I like to say cooperative services architecture. If we look at this, we can see, like I say, philosophically, there's nothing wrong with microservices. I do feel like it's a very strong statement to say that microservices in and of themselves are a mistake, and then to back that statement by saying because people have done it wrong, people have made a mess, people haven't been able to wrangle these services themselves. And I agree that those mistakes do exist, and that people have designed services and organized them around organizations where they probably shouldn't have done that, or business functions where they may not have made sense. But that in and of itself does not make microservices as a philosophy the wrong thing to do. I feel like, moving fast is not always the aim. This is not a world where we need to, I know people say move fast and break things, but it matters when you move fast and you're not truthful, when you're the first to post a message or post some news, and that news isn't actually true news, right? And the same can be for your services that you're creating, to be, we're moving first and we're moving fast, and we've created this service, and this service actually isn't doing a service for anyone. that's not what we're aiming at here. What we're aiming at is being able to deliver systems that have high resilience, that have great stability, that are able to make promises that they can keep, and that are able to interact with your customers, your users, other users of the services in a way that is truthful, in a way that is productive, and in a way that moves you, that makes progress within your company, and ultimately helps you to be profitable and hopefully kind to the earth at the same time. And so for that reason, I feel like we should remember, as you vote, we cannot judge this philosophy by its abuses. And for that reason, you should make sure to vote that microservices are indeed not a huge mistake.
Thank you very much, Kiki. And now, Pete, your final closing statement.
Sure. I agree that we shouldn't judge an architecture by its worst applications, but we have to keep in mind that people collectively will always make mistakes, and we should set up architectures and systems for them to fall into the pit of success rather than tend towards the mistake. I think that microservices architectures make cheap changes cheaper, and I think they make expensive changes more expensive. And I would much rather my expensive changes get cheaper, even if it means my cheap changes have to be a little bit more expensive. I think just because Rails led to a bunch of really bad monoliths doesn't mean that the monolithic architecture can't work with the modern tools that we have today. Got stronger static analysis tools, better development environments, that kind of thing. I think microservices are ideal in a world without reorgs and changing requirements. I think the instant that you've got a requirement that requires changes to 2 or more services, you've introduced a lot of pain. And for that reason, I think that services should be one of the last tools you reach for. They should be a last resort rather than something that you immediately reach for. Doesn't mean all microservices are bad. Doesn't mean service-oriented architecture is bad. It just means that they should be a last resort rather than the first tool that you reach for. And that's my statement.
Thank you very much, Pete. This was an amazing panel. Now, before, so we have now the results from the second voting. And before I read them out, let me tell you that we have a Q&A here. So the way Q&A works, I'm going to paste a link. And after I declare the voting results, let's all click that link. It will bring us to another Zoom where the public can join us for the questions. So feel free to join the Q&A. The Q&A is in a separate room from the tracks. So the tracks will resume in 10 minutes. So we'll have about 10 minutes for Q&As themselves. And if folks want to hang out with the panelists, you can still be in the Q&A room because there is no time limit in that room until the next talk is over. So now let me tell you what the democracy decided. So first of all, I must say we lost about half the voters. We did not lose the audience, but it's a complicated subject. So we have the after vote is about half the original vote. So the original vote, we had 98 votes, and we had 77.6% that microservices were not a mistake. So the team mistake essentially is striving to defeat, disrupt the existing order. In the original vote, the team mistake had 22.4%. And in the final vote, we have 49, exactly 50% of the vote, but we have team mistake now has 26.5% of the vote. So based on the original criteria, which team swings the most votes, right? We can say that the team mistake managed to wrangle about 4% increase in the group of people skeptical about microservices. So they did make substantial inroads into the incumbent territory. But on the other hand, we collectively lost about 50% of the votes. So it's interesting, how do we judge this? I think it will be a question of interpretation.
I think we all lost.
American people lost.
We confused people. People need to send in their mail-in ballots. They need time to think. They need to send in their mail-in ballots, and then we'll know.
Listen, all I heard was we got 26% of the vote and we won. So that's good for me.
I'll see you in court.
With that, let us all click the link, which is at the end of the chat, guys. So it will bring us to another Zoom. It will ask you to leave and